Free, free, set them free. Free, free, set
Hey,
them
what's up? It's
free.
your girl, Sarah Valentine, on the scene in Chicago. You know how we do. Crazy Chicks TV. I am here with the author, Mark Johnson. What y'all know about that, okay? I am here with Mark Johnson. This is all about Basketball Slave. I want to know what brings you to Chicago.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here today. What I started off as being in Chicago because, first of all, the Harlem Globetrotters started here, right here in Chicago. A lot of times people think that, you know, they started in New York City because they say Harlem, but they actually started right here in Chicago on Dearborn Street. And Chicago is really a mecca of basketball. The World Series of basketball used to take place here in the early 30s. And actually in 1939, the Harlem Renaissance won the World Series. In 1940, the Harlem Globetrotters won the World Series of basketball right here in Chicago, Chicago Stadium.
Oh wow! Now I totally thought that Harlem Globetrotters were in Harlem. Okay, so Andy Johnson. What is the relation of Andy Johnson?
Well, Andy Johnson was my father. He was one of the first blacks with in the NBA. Played for the Philadelphia Warriors, and one of the rich touring in the early '50s. And my father was part of that team that toured all around the world, what actually made them this famous team that they are today.
All right, so Basketball Slave. Now, what made that title? How did you come up with that title?
You know, I really wish I could take credit for that title, a basketball slave, but that's actually a quote my father used. Growing up in the early '50s, his actual quote was, "My high school and college used me, and the pros sold me. I was a basketball slave," and that's what I titled the book, Basketball Slave.
Second. Now, how long did this take, and what actually brought this about?
Well, actually, it was an 8-year project. I had to go do a lot of research and reach out to a lot of people in that era. And being my father being who he was, I had access to a lot of these people. And kind of what started it is that back in, I guess maybe about 10 years ago, my father, they started a pension plan program for the NBA pre-65 players. And in filling out the paperwork, my father was denied. So kind of going back and forth, you need to play 5 years. My father played 4 years, 3 years with Philadelphia Warriors. Before the Warriors were the Warriors, before the Sixers, Philadelphia Sixers were the Sixers, they were the Philadelphia Warriors. And then he got loaned. And when I say loaned, we can kind of get into that later. But he was actually loaned to Chicago because actually Chicago did not have a team in 19. Well, the last team Chicago had were the Chicago Stags in 1949. So that whole from 1950, 1960, Chicago did not have a NBA team. So because of the Harlem Globetrotters starting here and them having a following in those earlier years, they used my father, Andy Johnson, and another Harlem Globetrotter, Woody Salisbury, also played for the Philadelphia Warriors, to start the expansion team, which were the Chicago Packers. My father, along with Walt Bellamy and Woody Salisbury and a few other players.
Okay. All right.
So, and kind of going back to your original question, kind of what started is that when I found out they denied my father, and I said, Dad, kind of what happened, because you had to play 5 years under the plan. And my father said, well, I played 4 years, and after that season was over, the owner came to me and had me sign a contract. So basically, he was under contract for that 5th year. But there was dissension between the NBA and Abe Saperstein, who was the owner of the Harlem Globetrotters, who wanted to put an all-black team in the NBA in those earlier years, and he was denied from the NBA. And start doing all this research, I found out that, they didn't allow black ball players in the NBA. Yeah, there was a quota system, 2 black ball players per team, and not all franchises took advantage of having black ball players. And so it's kind of funny because when I went back in the history books, all the teams that chose not to have black players, they folded immediately. So there's really only 8 teams that survived within that 10-year period of the 50s to 1960.
Okay, I did not know that. And I'm gonna just keep it real here. How much did you get through this? Like when you were doing all your research and stuff, I know that you did not know all of this? Were you like shocked by like a lot of this different stuff? And then how much more information did you receive? And what has it done for you during this book?
Well, yeah, again, I started off just really kind of helping my dad get his pension. And after uncovering how they didn't allow black ball players in the NBA, and I'm like, wow, first of all, we kind of dominate the sport as it stands now. But now to think about not even allowing us to play in the NBA. So I thought that was just an injustice that was happening to my father. So I start uncovering and found out it was not just my father was dealing with this injustice, but it was all the black ball players. I mean, I'm talking about all Americans. There's even a situation in 1955. I found out that when Bill Russell, along with Willie Knowles, got recruited, they got drafted, and this is kind of how the NBA kind of got away with things, because you got to remember now we're dealing with the civil rights era, that 1955, 56 era, and they actually drafted. They would draft black ball players, but they wouldn't keep them. And like I was saying, in St. Louis, they drafted 5 black ball players. Bill Russell was amongst them, and Willie Knowles was another one. Well, we all know what happened to Bill Russell. They didn't keep him. He ended up going to Boston, and we know the history from there. And along with Willie Knowles, went to New York and became an all-star there. The other players actually played in what they call the Eastern League. So these were the only leagues that these black ball players were allowed to play, was in either with the Harlem Globetrotters. So, in uncovering this history, I found out that, whenever I say Harlem Globetrotters, people say, oh yeah, I see all the Globetrotters, they spin the ball on their fingers and on their heads and those kind of things. But back in that day, they were serious ball players. Okay. That's the only place they could play, was the Harlem Globetrotters.
Now, where do you think that the transition, or through your research, where did the transition come to whereas they're just like entertainment?
Well, that actually started, that actually started in the early 60s when, the NBA really started becoming integrated. Actually, in the back of the book, I compiled all the black players that played and the teams that they played for. I always ask, what's the oldest, when you talk about history of the NBA and black ball players and the first players, I say, who can you think of? And the first names that usually come to mind is, Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell, Oscar Robinson. But those guys actually didn't play. They actually didn't come into the league until 1959, 60. Okay. Black ball players start actually coming in the league in 1950 when the league started again. It actually started because before the 1950, it was the NBL, the National Basketball League, and the BAA. They merged, and that became the NBA. And there were a few players that played for the NBL teams. But what happened is, you got to remember now, these are the first blacks that are playing in the league. A lot of the white players didn't want them playing, and they would literally take, there were a lot of race riots that would break out at these games because the white players would play these black ball players pretty hard and foul them pretty hard in the name of defense, and that would start a lot of fights.
What would you want the reader to get from this book?
Well, there's several things I wanted the reader to get from the book. First of all, like I said, this is the first time in the back of the book, I actually start, the Harlem Globetrotters started in the late 20s. I want them to understand that, in 1940 and 1930, like I said, 1939, 1940, there were a World Series of basketball that was being played right here in Chicago. I want them to understand that, the dunks, the slam dunks, the fancy dribbling, all the things that they have now, that kind of started way back. Right. So that's one thing I want people to understand.
Free, set them free.